you see him on the news.
CNN.com contributor, Dean Obeidallah. So, Dean...
Watch him at comedy clubs.
When I say Mecca, do you think of a holy place or an urban clothing line?
Read his articles, and you hear him on the radio. The Dean Obeidallah Show is on live right here on SiriusXM Progress, Channel 127.
And welcome to the show, brothers and sisters of the resistance, Wednesday, March 20th. I'm Dean Obeidallah, hoping to be your MBFF. I'm on Twitter, of course, at Dean Obeidallah, where I wait breathlessly for you to follow me there, because I'm needy. Of course, Facebook.com/Dean of Radio, where you can actually watch the monologue if you so choose. So, we got a lot to talk about. First, recap. Last night, we talked about the Electoral College and its history tied to slavery. And I tweeted about it. Of course, I tweet out the monologue all the time. And last night and then today, again, more right-wingers, all upset. How dare I say, how dare I speak the truth that the fact that our electoral college is based, at least in part, if not primarily, to protect slavery. That's what it was about. James Madison, the proponent of it, was a slave owner from Virginia, folks. Let's not play games. That's what it was about. We all know what it was about. And they get upset. There are people on the right, and even some in the center, and they are white, who get very uncomfortable when we talk about race. And we can never break through the garbage, the racism, any hope of common ground if people get so defensive that you're going to deny reality. It's not worth it. Just to have a conversation, though you know what you're talking about, and I'll send them something. I'll even share something from a major media outlet, not Dean Obeidallah's blog, so the fake news. All right, then you want to remain a moron or a bigot. I can't tell you, but I'm telling you, when a slave owner proposes something to keep power, I can assure you it's to perpetuate white supremacy, because the guy owns black people like they're not human beings in his view, and they're not the way they treated them. And that's what it was all about. So let's not play games. There were some other practical concerns. Yes, I understand that as well. But the one about the slave ownership and the slave states barely gets talked about in school. And I'm glad we had that conversation. And today, Trump was tweeting about the Electoral College because I think he watched our segment. No, actually, because other Democrats talked about it as well. We got a lot to talk about. First, we need some humor. Today, before I play a clip from Stephen Colbert, you may not have seen this. You may have been lucky to avoid your eyes. But Donald Trump has been attacking Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway. And this is lighter. We'll do this for a second. It's not what we're going to talk about, I can assure you. But I'm enjoying this. I have to say that. Because you have George Conway, a lawyer, a conservative, slamming Trump more and more and more on Twitter. And over the weekend, George Conway, Kellyanne's husband, actually said that he thinks Trump has narcissistic personality disorder. And Trump today goes crazy. George Conway, referred to as Mr. Kellyanne Conway by those who know him, I'm reading Trump's tweet here, is very jealous of his wife's success and angry that I didn't help him and give him a job that he desperately wanted. I barely know him, but just take a look. A stone-cold loser and a husband from hell. He called Kellyanne Conway's husband a husband from hell. This is Donald Trump, whose wife Melania, I'm pretty sure, has gone full Shawshank Redemption and dug her way out of the White House through a sewer pipe just to escape. The guy was cheating on all his wives. And today, here is the ridiculous part. I'm not even kidding. So you've got Trump and George Conway fighting in public. Today, Kellyanne Conway, the wife of George Conway, asked about it. And who did she side with? One guess. She sided with Trump over her own husband, saying that, Trump is a counterpuncher, literally said that, and that the president is free to respond when he's accused of having a mental illness. Here's my question. White people, this is breaking our heart. This white-on-white violence is too much for us to take. White people, get your crap together. And you know what? If you're a white person, especially a white conservative, in 2020, vote for a candidate of color. I mean, what do you got to lose, right? What do you got to lose? Things are going so white people are fighting each other left and right here. What do you got to lose, white people? Vote for a candidate of color. That's my plea. And here's Colbert last night on the feud between Donald Trump and George Conway. And it just makes me laugh. This white-on-white violence is just horrible. It's heartbreaking. Here's clip number one.
Kellyanne's husband, George Conway, is an outspoken critic of the president. In the past, he has said that some of Trump's reported actions would unquestionably be grounds for impeachment, telling the president, your stupidity knows no bounds, and saying that the administration is like a show in a dumpster fire. Which... lay it out there, George. which is awkward because his wife is one of the Flaming Trash Pile star turd jugglers.
So, and it was just great to hear the audience laughing at the tweets that George Conway said about Trump. And just forget politics. It is kind of weird to have, imagine you work someplace and your spouse is bad-mouthing your boss in front of everyone in the public. It's got to be a little awkward, but I love it. I hope they just continue to fight like that. And then last night we had a very serious conversation with two great lawyers. We had Danny Savalas here and Elliot Williams about Devin Nunes' lawsuit against Twitter because Devin Nunes didn't get retweeted enough and he didn't get liked enough on his tweet. So he is a snowflake and had to sue him. So we had a serious conversation about the legal part of it. But here's Colbert on the comedic part of it. It's really funny. Let's hear clip number 2, please.
Nunes is suing Twitter for allowing accounts to insult him. What? That's what Twitter is. That's all it does. Can you tell the sun not to shine? Can you tell the rivers not to flow? Can you tell @MagaMan5000 not to call me the king of the beta male soy boy cucks after I suggested that Frozen was in fact a delightful children's movie? Nunes' lawsuit is swinging for the fences here because for defaming his good name, Nunes is suing Twitter for $250 million. Now that sounds like a lot, but they came up with the number using a simple legal formula. You take the value of Devin Nunes' reputation and you add $250 million.
Comedy, my friends. Thankfully, it keeps us sane and it drives Donald Trump crazy. So it's two great things at the same time. So let's talk about something. Today's an anniversary of something remarkably bad that happened. Today is a horrible anniversary. And I want to talk about it, and ultimately I'll tie it to Donald Trump, believe me. But today is the 16th anniversary of something. And if you were on Twitter or if you watched the news a little bit today, you might know. And it's the 16th anniversary of us, the United States of America, attacking Iraq based on a lie. That's what it is. And as a result of that, what I view as an illegal war, war is not the right term. A war is, in my view, two combatants that are somewhat equal. When you just attack another country based on a lie, that's not a war. That's an attack. Like 9/11 happened for us, then Iraq's 9/11 is we attack them. And because of the Iraq War, almost 5,000 American troops were killed, thousands wounded, came back with PTSD, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians killed. They can't even quantify. Some estimates are literally 1 million people because they can't tell. But hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. And then, of course, the destabilization of the Middle East and allowing the rise of ISIS and the influence of Iran to go across the region, all thanks to George W. Bush's administration. Now, here is the Chutzpah of the Year award. It goes to Ari Fleischer today. Donald Trump, he should work for Trump at this point because Ari Fleischer, who at times honestly was kind of reasonable about stuff, he's an establishment Republican, tweeted defending his work as Bush's spokesperson during the war, tweeting, "The Iraq War began 16 years ago. There is a myth about the war that I have been meaning to set straight for years. After no WMDs were found, the left claimed Bush lied, people died. This accusation itself is a lie. It's time to put it to rest." And then he went on other stuff. So there is Ari Fleischer taking a playbook from Donald Trump, gaslight people. Just lie, try to rewrite history for us. And David Corn from Mother Jones, who's written a lot about the Iraq War and the lies perpetrated to get us into that war, went after Ari Fleischer on Twitter and calling out the BS. And he's talked about Dick Cheney starting out the push for the war in a major speech, claiming Saddam was amassing weapons of mass destruction, and the list goes on. Here's my question. 16 years after the Iraq War, why is Dick Cheney not in prison? Why is he not in prison? We'll go through it. Why? And I ask that because if this man who was involved in orchestrating a war that results in the death of hundreds of thousands of people, involved in being a supervisor and approving of torture, and then personally profiting from the war, which I'll go through all of it, and he's not in prison, how do we ever hope to get Donald Trump in prison? Dick Cheney was a war criminal, and he walks the streets. Donald Trump is corrupt and horrible and vile. But if Dick Cheney is not in prison, how are we going to get Trump in prison? Which ultimately means, again, November 3rd, 2020, it's up to us. Forget Robert Mueller, forget the prosecutor and the U.S. attorney here in New York. Us, the same people who won November 2018 by record numbers, us. But here is what Dick Cheney, I want to remind people, because I was looking back at it, and I had forgotten most of it so many years ago, all the lies that Dick Cheney told to justify this war. And it really was. Bush did a little bit. Then Bush kind of stepped back, and it was all Cheney. Cheney had his agenda. The first speech, August 2002, just less than a year from 9/11, there's Dick Cheney saying, quote, simply stated, there's no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he's amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us. Cheney also repeatedly, during this run-up to the war of March 2003, said publicly, numerous times, that 9/11 ringleader Mohammed Atta had met secretly in Prague with Iraqi intelligence officials. Even though the CIA and FBI had dismissed this allegation, there is Dick Cheney repeating it over and over and over again, just like Trump does. And sometimes we forget Trump is horrible, but there's been Republicans before who are horrific that led us to a war. And there's no excusing Trump. That's not my point. The point is, Republicans have been horrible for a long, long time. Trump has just taken it to new levels with his bigotry and corruption right in front of us. What else did Dick Cheney do? March 2003, right around the time of going into the war, he asserted that Saddam Hussein has a long-standing relationship with Al-Qaeda. In reality, intelligence community never said that. But Dick Cheney said it. He literally just kept lying to the American people. As the 9/11 Commission found out after the war, they said there had been no intelligence confirming significant contacts between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. This is not a case of Dick Cheney looking at the data, the intelligence, and interpreting it a certain way. It's literally Dick Cheney was lying. He was making up that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11 to get us to go to war. A few months into the war, in September 2003, there's Dick Cheney on Meet the Press and asked by the host about a poll which showed that a solid majority of Americans believe that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. And the host asked him, and Cheney said about this, I think it's not surprising that people make that connection. It's not surprising because you kept lying to people. And here's the poll they were talking about, September 2003. Remember, there is no intelligence that showed that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. Dick Cheney kept saying it over and over to the point September 2003, 69%, nearly 70% of Americans thought that Saddam Hussein was involved in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That was Dick Cheney, my friends. That was Dick Cheney, and he wasn't done. During the war in 2004, there's Dick Cheney again saying overwhelming, that's the exact quote, that Al-Qaeda had a relationship with Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, and he said media reports suggesting otherwise were irresponsible. This is how much Dick Cheney lied to the American people over the years. And here, I'll read a high-level context with bin Laden and Iraqi intelligence officials. That was a lie. He just continued to lie to the American people. And then in 2009, all of a sudden, Dick Cheney, I made a mistake. He didn't apologize. He goes, 2009, he goes, I do not believe and have never seen any evidence to confirm that Hussein was involved in 9/11. We had that reporting for a while, but eventually it turned out not to be true. So Dick Cheney admits, June 2009, I'll read his quote again, I do not believe and have never seen any evidence to confirm that Hussein was involved in 9/11. But there he is, for years, as I read in 2002, 3, and 4, talking about the relationship between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, knowing what he's doing, trying to build support for a war and a lie. And then we learned later, years later, that Dick Cheney was involved in some level in approving torture of the detainees. A U.S. report of our government, this is not like a left-leaning thing, a U.S. report of our government found that, and there was calls for him to be criminally prosecuted for this torture, that detainees were waterboarded, hung by their wrists, confined in coffins. They did rectal feeding, sleep-deprived, beaten. Some died. 2002, one detainee died on a concrete floor of hypothermia. All of this documented. And people called for him to be prosecuted because he should have been. But what happened? As you might recall, President Obama wanted to turn a page and said, we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards. And a lot of us were maybe disappointed, but we said that made sense at the time. So he lied to get us in a war. He was involved in planning and approving of torture in violation of federal laws and international law. And worse, he profited. He profited. Altogether, about $138 billion from the U.S. government was paid to private contractors. during the Iraq War, during the war, and for rebuilding. $138 billion. The biggest recipient of money. You want to guess where? You know the answer. We all know the answer. Dick Cheney's Halliburton subsidiary, KBG, got nearly $40 billion in federal contracts, including no bid contracts. And here is Rand Paul, when he still had a soul, 2009, slamming Dick Cheney and making the very point that Dick Cheney was against the war in the mid-1990s, gets a job at Halliburton, gets in the U.S. government, and all of a sudden his former company is getting no bid contracts and Dick Cheney is profiting. Here's clip number 3. This is Rand Paul from 2009.
When the Iraq War started, Halliburton got a $1 billion no-bid contract. Some of the stuff has been so shoddy and so sloppy that our soldiers are over there dying in the shower from electrocution. I mean, it shouldn't be sloppy work, it shouldn't be bad procurement process, but it really shouldn't be maybe that these people are so powerful they direct even policy. There's a great YouTube of Dick Cheney in 1995 defending Bush #1, and he goes on for about 5 minutes. He's being interviewed, I think, by the American Enterprise Institute. And he says it would be a disaster, it'd be vastly expensive, it'd be a civil war, we'd have no exit strategy. He goes on and on for 5 minutes. Dick Cheney said it would be a bad idea, and that's why the first Bush didn't go into Baghdad. Dick Cheney then goes to work for Halliburton, makes hundreds of millions of dollars as their CEO. Next thing you know, he's back in government. It's a good idea to go into Iraq.
So there you go. I know the audio was not the greatest quote. It was 2009, recorded from someone in the audience. But what he said is, Dick Cheney, in the mid-1990s, in the father Bush administration, said, don't go into Iraq. It's a horrible idea. Civil war, it's not going to end well. So they don't go into Baghdad. They just have the war with Kuwait, to get Kuwait unoccupied, and ends. But then he works in Halliburton, where he makes millions and millions and millions of dollars as CEO, and goes into the White House, and all of a sudden a war with Iraq is a good idea. And if you have any doubt that Dick Cheney profited, let me clarify that. Let me make it clear that he did profit. He got deferred salary as vice president. He got deferred salary in 2001 from Halliburton, $205,000. 2002, he got $160,000. 2003, $178,000. 2004, $194,000. Each of these years paid in deferred compensation to Dick Cheney while vice president. Dick Cheney's stock options, he started in the White House as VP, they were worth $240,000. 2 years into the war, what were they worth? $8 million, and keep going higher and higher. And when Dick Cheney left Halliburton to become VP, he got a big, huge bonus. I'm not talking about a $100,000 bonus. I'm not talking about a $2 million bonus. I'm talking about a down payment, a bonus that says so big, it's a down payment on you're going to go into the White House in this administration and make his money. And how much did he get as a bonus when he left Halliburton? $34 million bonus. And he goes in. So here you have Dick Cheney lied to America about weapons of mass destruction, literally fabricated stories about 9/11, Saddam Hussein, and al-Qaeda being interrelated. He was involved in torture. New York Times and others, I went back and read the articles calling for prosecution, but President Obama said no. And he was a war profiteer. And today he's a free man on television doing commentary. He should be in prison. And if he's not in prison, how are we going to get Donald Trump in prison? That's my question. If a person like this has gotten away with all these crimes, and I fear, will the next Democratic president try to be like President Obama and say, let's move forward. Let's not, because we know it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to indict Trump as a sitting president because of DOJ regulations. So he gets out and say a Democrat trounces them, Trump, one of our people, our great people are elected. I won't even say name. Doesn't matter who it is. And they go in and go, we won the House. We kept the House. We won the Senate. We won the White House. Let's move on. No prosecution of Trump. Let's move forward, look forward, and not behind. And I fear that can happen again with Donald Trump. Because if it happened to Dick Cheney and this was the record, how do we prosecute Donald Trump? That's my question to you here. 16 years later, Dick Cheney should be in prison in the United States or some world court type of prison, and show others involved in that administration. It's odd. George Bush, when you see a lot of the reporting going back in time, was correcting the record. Literally, that 2003 statement when I said Dick Cheney was on Meet the Press and said, I understand why Americans would see a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. George Bush put a statement a day later going, we have no evidence of any connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. You literally had George Bush, the president, trying to do damage control on Dick Cheney's own agenda. And I'm not excusing George Bush completely from this. I'm just saying this was a Dick Cheney operation. And he walks free. President Obama, great president. This was one of the mistakes that we look back in time. If they had prosecuted Dick Cheney, perhaps someone like Donald Trump would not have run for president, realizing if you're a vice president or a president, you actually are not above the law, because that's the message we've always sent. You can go to prison. And part of me actually thinks that. If Dick Cheney was prosecuted fully, Donald Trump doesn't run for president, fearing that, you know what, I could win and maybe go to jail for all the crimes I've committed. So I'd love to hear from you. You're my guest at the top of the hour. We got some great guests coming up. Next hour, author of a book, Until We Reckon, Daniel Sarid, about violence, mass incarceration, and road to repair. In the third hour, our friend Shelley Wright, country music star, LGBT activist, will be in studio with us for the third hour. But you're my guest now. I'd love to hear from you about any issue, but what about this issue? Do you think if Dick Cheney was prosecuted, do you think that maybe Donald Trump didn't run for president? Do you think Cheney should have been prosecuted? And are you concerned like me that some Democrat wins big and in their own calculation says, I'm going to put America first and we're not going to prosecute Donald Trump. We're going to move on. We won big. We won the Senate. We've got the House. Let's just do our policies and go forward and forget him. He's an old man. Just let him live out his life. I fear that. And that again would say you're above the law. We can't do that. 866-997-4748. Love to hear from you right after this break. You're listening to the Dean Obeidallah Show, where we crush Trump's lies every single day
on Sirius